Good morning and welcome to the Daily Ding here on the Athletic NBA show. I am Jared Weiss. I am joined by the Athletic's Toronto Raptors writer Eric Corrine, and of course, Andrew Schlex is producing. And Eric, we are here today in our writer series to talk about your story on Darko, and I'm going to let you say the last name because I keep fumbling.
Darko Rajakovic.
It's
And
a
if
great
I
story.
am if I am mispronouncing it, I apologize to Darko and really all of Serbia. I'm just gonna maybe all of the Balkans. I'll just issue a blanket apology now. You guys are better at basketball than I am, and my pronunciation lexicon. I think I've got this one, but in case I don't, apologies.
Okay, so Darko Rajakovic, he is replacing Nick Nurse, and he comes from a pretty good basketball lineage. And it starts all the way back in Belgrade. So can you kind of just walk us through his background and why you wanted to capture it the way you did?
Um, So, why I wrote about him is pretty simple. I think going back to 2008 when I first started covering the Raptors, it's like, oh, interesting new person is now part of organization. Uh, better be I should probably profile this person. And the first person I really did that for at my old job was Jermaine O'Neal, the vaunted 3 months of Jermaine O'Neal as a Raptor. So Darko he has to beat that bar in order to not be. Yeah, I don't think I did a Landry Fields one. So I think that's the bar to not finish with like the most disappointing Eric Corrine profile, big ass profile turned into disaster. But I think what's really interesting about Darko is he is sort of an unknown. Like most, he wasn't even among the like most known assistants, sort of making the rounds and head coach searches. Like you had Charles Lee from Milwaukee, you had Kevin Young in Phoenix. Sam Cassell's name is always sort of coming up, and while Darko Rajakovic's name was constantly mentioned in the Raptors search,
Mm-hmm.
he even sort of was behind, not in terms of the Raptors view, but in terms of the public imagination, like maybe behind Lee, certainly behind Kenny Atkinson, even former Raptors assistant Sergio Scariolo, who's I believe is in Italy now, could be in Spain, but I think he's coaching full time in Italy. Um, and he's in his 60s and doesn't necessarily make sense for a team that might be going young. We can talk about that later. And Rajakovic was sort of the least known quantity available of the names that were making the round. So I thought it was a really good opportunity to dive into the details about somebody who didn't have much of a reputation except for people who are really into the weeds of the NBA, so to speak. And so yeah, I just did the usual deep dive in terms of like where he started out, his connections throughout the NBA, and as we'll get to, sort of my conversation with Sam Presti sort of opened up a lot of that.
So the Raptors tend to have a track record of hiring their assistants, and it certainly worked last time. Also, there was a G League connection there. So why did they decide to go this route, do you think? And what did you learn about Darko that made it make sense to you?
Um, well, I think there are two parts of that. One is the Darko part, and one is the Raptors part. Last year for the Raptors, more like even as much of a disappointment as is it was sort of mystifying, I think, to everybody involved. I never heard like a great answer, off court answer. On court, I think we could see what was happening, but off court, like why a team with such, I hate to use this term, but for the lack of a better term, good vibes in 21-22 went to like one of the worst vibes team in 22 and 23. And like, yeah, you can pin some of that on Nick Nurse, and maybe he had some faults as a communicator. Maybe he didn't give enough rope to some of the younger players, but it wasn't all Nick Nurse. It was like it was a little bit of everything, and what, and so that's where the Raptors are coming from. So what you've seen from the Raptors is them really going outside of their comfort zone in a lot of areas. Like they have a new uh they got rid of a lot of people who have been with the organization for a long time, whether it's in the strength and conditioning department or the security department. And I don't think like, part of my brain is like, what if Fred VanVleet shot 38% last year from three instead of 34% from three? Would like most of these guys still be around? But that's just how my stupid brain works.
It's also right,
So
but sure.
yeah, but the Darko part of it is interesting because he is like really a like sort of a fountain of positivity and more than that, just enthusiasm. And so to whatever degree the people who are left over from last year are still wearing what happened, are still confused by what happened, are still disappointed by what happened, Darko Rajakovic isn't only like a fresh face without that baggage, he's a guy who is like legitimately excited for this opportunity, legitimately brings his own ideas, and likes the idea of trying to be with a team that is evolving and has to get a bit out of its comfort zone in order to move forward. And you combine that with some of the things that the Raptors always believe in, certainly an international background, a G League background, and having worked with some really great coaches from Monty Williams to Michael Malone, to Billy Donovan, Scott Brooks, and you got somebody who has just such a mix of experience that you can't really say, well, here's the next thing he has to do before he's a head coach. Like he's clearly has the requisite, he's checked all the boxes except for being a head coach by this point in the NBA.
Yeah. Okay, let's go to the Sam Presti part of this interview because that was like a fun curveball. It's always fun when you're reading a story about somebody and it's like a profile, and then someone that that you feel like is probably not really related pops up, and suddenly they're talking in the piece. So how did the Presti interview come together, and what did you learn about Darko through that?
So Sam Presti brought Darko Rajakovic to the NBA twice, essentially. He he got him involved with the NBA in the first place when Presti was still working under R.C. Buford in San Antonio, and Presti would have been like a mid-20s, wonderkind savant type at that point. As I think he was assistant general manager, but he was over in at Basketball Without Borders in Treviso, Italy, and he was sort of looking for somebody who could write up reports, act as like a quasi, not quite a scout because he wasn't necessarily going around and watching games for the Spurs, but he could like write up reports on players they were interested in, just sort of keep them posted. And so Presti went to Maurizio Gherardini, who then became the Raptors assistant general manager under Brian Colangelo shortly after that. Gherardini was running Treviso at that time and had a lot to do with running the camp, and said, I'm looking for a young guy in this area who specializes in this part of the world. Can you help me? And I talked to Maurizio Gherardini, and he's like, well, Darko had just come to the camp. His team had won, in his junior team had won in Serbia. And what he noticed, Maurizio Gherardini, is he's this enthusiastic, smart, young coach. They were about the same age, Presti and Rajakovic. So they hit it off. Rajakovic is, for the better part of 7-8 years, is working for the Spurs in either an informal or formal capacity. He came over to the G League a few times, or sorry, to Summer League a few times, to act as an assistant coach, and that's sort of what got him really thinking, Rajakovic, that he could maybe get involved in the NBA or North American basketball somehow. But of course, Presti shortly after that goes on to become a member or to lead the Seattle Supersonics, who became the Oklahoma City Thunder. And after a few different coaches, Presti needed a new G League or D League then coach for the Tulsa 66ers, I believe. They are now
Yeah.
the Oklahoma City Blue, which always just makes me think of a sad basketball team. But
The frowny
but
face of a basketball team.
yeah, yeah, so my favorite part of that story was Presti recall, or sorry, it was Rajakovic recalling Presti asking him, quote, 12 times if he was sure he wanted to move from Madrid, where Rajakovic had moved to coaching in like the third or fourth division in Spain, to Tulsa, which is, no shade to Tulsa, and Andrew Schlecht is going to be hearing this. I don't know what his feelings on Tulsa are, but like maybe I'd rather live in Madrid, is all I'm saying. But he
A little
definitely
bit better.
wanted to be involved. My favorite sort of behind the scenes story about that interview, though, is that like, we're both sports reporters. We know what the Oklahoma City Thunder's reputation is as far as media availability, and like, as I've said a few times now, the Thunder were great to me and very open, and like totally forthcoming, and facilitated this interview, and I'm thankful for that. But that isn't necessarily what they're known for, and especially what some of their stars over the last, in the prior generation were known for, let's
It
say.
wasn't good. It wasn't good for the readers
Yeah.
at home.
And so Sam Presti, I'm trying to word this in a way he won't be upset about, called me surprisingly close to the start of free agency to talk about Darko Rajakovic. And in my head, I'm like, shouldn't you guys be like in a war room somewhere instead of talking to me? But I think that, maybe that says a little bit about Oklahoma City's status in free agency, and that they're just waiting for teams to start calling them about dumping salary.
No,
But
that just isn't a test. It's a testimony to how amazing Darko is. That's all it
but
is.
but Sam, this was my second thing, was he was very, very happy to talk about Darko Rajakovic. And that's the best when a pretty famous person inside the NBA wants to talk about your relatively anonymous subject of this profile. So it really worked out for your boy over here.
So okay, last thing on this story, you ended it with a little vignette about parking in Serbia. Why?
um well, I've driven in Croatia, which
Oh, really?
is, I don't think that's a humble brag. Like, I rented a car on vacation. Yeah, baby. But there was this town called Šibenik, and my then girlfriend, now wife, was like very stressed at how close to like the brick siding of the streets we were at times, she being in the passenger seat. So for me, like the thought of like trying to find space in that type of street was something I felt I could write about a little bit, because it was like a very tangible memory for me personally, even though mine wasn't about parking. It was just about being on a two-way street that really probably should have been a one-way street, if that.
That's how
So
you know
that was
you're in
part of
Europe.
it. Yeah, that's, I thought I could describe it well. But also, the notion that, I don't want to spoil too much, but that Darko Rajakovic is clever and resourceful enough to, the phrase, I guess, is get in where he fits in, or is it fit in where he gets in? Whatever that phrase is.
You know where you fit in, I think.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. He's gonna make it work for himself and those around him. And I certainly didn't ask about the parallel parking. So like, it was something that Sam Presti brought up, like when my last question, asking about like, I usually do this as a writer, like any like lasting thoughts about him that I haven't covered, and he mentioned his parallel parking. So um I asked Darko about it, and he sort of gave me the money quote that I thought tied things together from a bigger picture. So that's why I ended with there. I know it was, some people might have been confused or read it as a non sequitur, but I liked the imagery, and I sort of thought it spiritually captured his journey to where he is now, which is one of the 30 jobs in the league.
Yeah, it connected to me as this idea of he gets it done in tight situations, and that's what he's walking into with Toronto. This team that like is sort of in a rebuild, but also sort of needs to win now and needs to figure out what's going on with like Pascal Siakam, for instance. So what the hell is going on with Pascal Siakam? What's going on with this team after Fred VanVleet left?
In my recent mailbag, I did a two-part mailbag, and the first question I answered was, "What are the Raptors doing?" So,
Well, that's not a fair
I
question. You can't answer that.
well, I mean,
Who could?
yeah, I tried, and I guess I'll somewhat steal from myself is that Masai Ujiri has this reputation, and I think largely because of the Carmelo Anthony trades and the Kawhi Leonard trade, as like this huge deal maker, this guy who really swings big. And certainly you cannot, and I'm not trying to take those trades away from him. They were, landmark deals that, we can fairly say really worked out for his teams at the time. I also think they were somewhat perfect moment trades. They were presented at a time where the status quo was no longer really an option. Obviously, Carmelo was forcing his way out of Denver. He was going into free agency. This was happening whether he liked it or not. And to in Masai Ujiri's advantage, Carmelo told him as much, which is, which was very useful at the time for him. With a little less cut and dry with the DeMar DeRozan Kawhi Leonard trade, but the Raptors had made the playoffs 5 straight years. In the prior 3 years, they had lost to Cleveland with LeBron James. 3 straight years, 12-2 in games. And that with 2 straight sweeps. Now, LeBron James had left for Los Angeles. You could say, well, why not one more try without LeBron in the conference? But, there were some pretty clear limitations for that version of the Raptors team. And before Masai Ujiri considered tearing it down, he's like, why don't we take a chance with this guy who is, all respect to DeMar, a clear, at his best is a championship difference maker, which he obviously ended up being. Other than that, I would say Masai Ujiri is like a conservative opportunist. He is very patient, sometimes to a fault, sometimes not. Sometimes waiting is absolutely the right thing to do. But I think we've got to the place where analysis is maybe paralysis. I'm sure that's not how they would describe it, but and according to Shams Charania's report, like there haven't been serious negotiations with Pascal Siakam on a max extension, which would basically be 4 years between 190 and 220 million, depending what happens with the cap next year. But they also haven't been especially close on a trade with anybody. There have been talks, but nothing super concrete. And I think, that all happened around the trade deadline. And I think, this isn't going to be a situation where there is this is my read on it now, where there's a perfect solution available. They're not going to get the, Donovan Mitchell package for Pascal Siakam 1 year ahead of free agency for any number of reasons. And Pascal Siakam's a 2-time All-Star, 2-time All-NBA player, between one of the 15 and 30 best players in the league, let's say. He's a max guy. Like those guys get paid max contracts. So it's not like even if you're able to negotiate him down a little bit, like you're basically looking at the max. So to me, it's almost a binary decision. And even if you're giving him the max to trade him later, and maybe that's what they're debating is trading him now versus signing him, and maybe he gets a little bit more value. But So I think that's the decision they're trying to make right now, and of course it's the end of August or almost the end of August, and it's just a weird time to try and make that trade. So if I had to bet, I will say this ends in a extension before the season. I don't feel good about that bet, and that leads to a cascade, and that's where the urgency should come from because OG Anunoby is a free agent next year. Gary Trent, or assuming he declines his player option, which as long as he's not injured, he will decline that option. Gary Trent will be an unrestricted free agent. Scotty Barnes will be rookie extension eligible after next season. Like they have a lot of big questions coming, and Siakam is just the start of
Also, who is their point guard?
it. So, fair question. They have four guaranteed starters, I would say. Scotty Barnes, Pascal Siakam, OG Anunoby, and Jakob Poeltl. I would say the fifth starter will come down to Gary Trent Jr. and Dennis Schroeder. Herbie Kuhn, the Raptors public address announcer, has a lot of fun. I don't even know if it's fun. He takes it very seriously, I think, in nailing those pronunciations. And his best one is still Mike Budenholzer, which I'm not even going to attempt. Anyway, we are far afield here. So it's either Schroeder if he starts, or I guess if he doesn't, it would be some Siakam Barnes hybrid. I think that's putting a lot of pressure on both of them as not only the playmakers, but the guys who have to set things up. And, I wonder sometimes if we talk too little or too much about the pressure of bringing the ball up the court. Coaches certainly talk about it a lot. But it's a thing. And like if Scotty Barnes and Pascal Siakam are your guys bringing up the court, I would expect to see a little more ball pressure than usual in the Raptors half court, I guess. So that's the decision they have to make. Right now, I bet that they start Trent and Barnes and Siakam are the quasi point guards, but I'm prepared to be wrong. And this is coming off one 20 to 25-minute conversation with Darko Rajakovic that had very little to do with the Raptors roster construction.
All right. Well, one day we'll figure out what the Raptors lineup is, and Eric Corrigan will be there to tell us all about it. So for Eric and Andrew Schlecht, I'm Jared Weiss, and we'll see you next time on The Ding. Now you got to say ding, ding.
Ding, ding.